Thank you. Thanks everyone. Thanks for coming out tonight. Thanks to the Alaska State Museum, Library, and Archives for sponsoring this talk, and particularly to Patrick O'Neill for wrangling all the moving parts. I love bringing this book, Permafrost is an Archive, to the State Museum because it was a museum exhibit called Decolonizing Alaska that sparked this project. I walked through those rooms over there in this building, looking at the Decolonizing Alaska artworks and thinking, yeah, right on, this is the conversation that I want to be in. It's a conversation about social equity on changing land. And so for this book, I interviewed scientists and historians and culture bearers, but Permafrost is an Archive dialogues first and foremost with artists and with works of art in order to think through questions about environment and society. And I took that research approach because of the exhibit I saw in this museum. So thank you, museum. Thank you, State Library. Thank you, State Archives. Thanks also to KTOO for coming out tonight and for working the magic with the mics. I do want to live in a world with robust public media in it, so I love what you're doing, K2. Thanks to Olga and Hearthside Books for coordinating a table and supplying the goods, and thanks also to Robert for running the Hearthside table, and then audience. Thank you for gathering. It's delightful to be in a room here together, here now together, thinking our bookish thoughts kind of all at the same time. And that's something that I deal with very directly in Permafrost as an Archive. Who are we with here now? So I'm in a great part of the room to kind of clock that. Who am I with here now? You can clock that too. You got to do some twisting in your seats. You got to do some squirming around to check out that kind of information, but you can do that, you know. That's honestly how we fill in our blind spots, right? It does take some squirming. So here's what to expect. I'll introduce the questions that drive this book. I'll show you some examples of works of art that played different roles in my thinking. I'll read you some excerpts from the book, and I will invite a couple of questions at the end. So who am I? Oh, we already have the construction slide. Who am I? I'm an essayist. What that means, I'll be very brief about this. I know you all showed up here for theory of the essay, but I'm going to really keep it short. I'm an essayist, and what that means is I'm committed to poetry, and I'm committed to philosophy. So poetry involves the movement of language. Philosophy involves the movement of the mind. And I love this blend of poetry and philosophy. For me, that often also manifests as a blend of, you could say, research and reverie. I like those words. Either way, I can't live without that mixture. I can't make sense of the most rich or complicated scholarly discoveries, I guess, without also dreaming them to life. That is the tradition of the essay. And that is why even if I am wearing my academic hat, I still require art. So arrow keys, we'll go that way. Let me tell you about the genesis of this book. Permafrost as an Archive works with three things: climate change, human history, and art. The premise of this work is that small northern communities need full creative cooperation from all kinds of different thinkers to first imagine and second build new ways forward in our local theaters of environmental upheaval. The core challenge that I see in getting that kind of full cooperation to the table is that there are some very difficult shared histories that we all carry here, whether we think about them or not. And many of those histories reinforce social divisions that disrupt the radical cooperation that climate change requires of us. So Permafrost as an archive asks, how can we come into better relationship with history, right, and carry it together? And then finally, my method or my angle of approach, remembering which direction the arrows go is a trick of the mind. So my angle of approach here is ekphrasis. Ekphrasis is a lovely Greek word with a very simple meaning. When one artwork of one medium enters into dialogue with an artwork of a different medium, that's ekphrasis. There's a long history of ekphrastic poetry, for example. And more recently, at present, this is a literary news blast for you, there's a rising and developing trend in the so-called creative nonfiction, which is my field. There's a rising trend of the ekphrastic essay. An ekphrastic essay dialogues with a work of art, like a weaving, or a sculpture, or a song, or a painting. As two examples, you see here a papier-mâché life-size hot pink moose by Leanne Charlie, and you see a semi-abstracted Arctic landscape. That's acrylic on canvas by Jane Isaacson. The papier-mâché life-size hot pink moose was on display at the Yukon Arts Center. It does not appear in my book at all, although I have dialogued with this moose extensively in an essay called Government Documents, but I wrote 0 sentences about this moose. That's part of why it's one of the examples here. I wrote 0 sentences asking the reader to imagine this thing. Like, why not? Maybe I think the moose is groovy. Maybe I think the moose is ugly. It doesn't really matter. What matters, what's important, is what aspects of the art spark unexpected lines of thought. So in this case, the sculpture's neon pinkness maybe didn't spark much for me. The life-size mooseness didn't spark much for me. I don't evoke those details. I don't evoke those facts of the art, only because my attention to the piece lay elsewhere. And the reason is because the material of the piece, the papier-mâché, really got into my imagination. That paper that was ripped and torn and glued into a moose, those are the pages of Yukon's umbrella final agreement. And so in Alaska, for land claims, we have ANCSA, the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. In Yukon, for land claims, they have the UFA, the Umbrella Final Agreement. So my thinking is very influenced by Leanne Charlie's story and her choices about tearing up the UFA and reassembling those pages into sculptural form. So those are the ideas that show up in the book. I'm going to read you an excerpt. I'll share just the first 2 pages with you of an essay called Government Documents. Although I will move you on from the history lesson here and return you to relationship with the moose. Government Documents, we said, right? It's called Government Documents, A Lineage of Blades. I'll come back to the blades. It starts like this. The artist makes sculptures out of government documents. She uses land use designation maps, legal texts, and so on. Her medium, papier-mâché. Her method, the tearing and pasting of paper, the tearing and pasting of documents. She works to the sound of paper ripping, paces her thinking by the ooze of thick glue. She rips, reassembles, rips, reassembles. Papier-mâché refuses clean lines. Yet the method performs the basic twinning gestures I can't get out of my head, destroying and connecting, dividing and binding. In 2019, I sit in an audience's second row, pressed elbow to elbow against the person next to me and he to the person next to him, and so on. Our rows of too close chairs create a temporary theater in the far end of a spacious art gallery. The artist is alone on the stage that our seating arrangement implies. She speaks, we listen, as planned. Then she distributes copies of a text and directs the audience to read it aloud. We do. Seed, release, and surrender, we read. And while reading aloud joins us physically to the document, it also prompts a mental distance. We hear ourselves over and over, seed, release, and surrender, and grow perplexed. This is page 15 of the Umbrella Final Agreement, the document adopted in 1990 by the Yukon Territory to guide its First Nations land claims settlements. Some weeks ago, I skimmed all 300 pages of this law. Like many laws, it is a ponderous read. But as I speak page 15 aloud, my skin prickles. This is, of course, the artist's object. And so it occurs to me that by the sound of our voices, we've arrived at the edge of the knife, the thinned to translucence place of power in this document, the blade. It goes on from there, of course, I'll stop, because page 15 of the UFA calls for First Nation signatories in Yukon to cede, release, and surrender their lands in order to then receive back title to a portion of those lands. Because of that, I became very interested in cutting and in severance, hence blades. Therefore, this is an essay, Government Documents. It's an essay that is going to move between the UFA, so Yukon land claims, and between archaeological periods that are defined largely in terms of what kind of knife or what kind of blade the people and the hunters are using. And it's going to move also into the more colonial conceptual cutting of the land with borders. And this is one of the longest essays in the book because I think if you're invested in our Northern society's social dynamics, then you're going to spend a lot of time thinking about land claims. Land claims is a pretty influential legal situation. It's very defining in Alaska and in the Yukon. My essay about it asks you to think in terms of severance and in terms of the traditions and practices of cutting things up. I'm going to leave that example not because there's not more to say, but because I want to also share with you a pretty different example. This is a semi-abstracted Arctic landscape by Jane Isaacson, and you might recognize it from the book cover. Unlike the moose, in this example, my thinking is very influenced by the visual presence of the piece and the visual choices that Jane Isaacson makes in it. For example, hopefully from where you're sitting, you see it as I do, but recognizing we have different eyes here. To my eye, the dominant shades are blue-gray and shades of brown. But when you come in close, when you come in really close to this canvas, the painting's, it's actually very full of very bright color. So just some details here. You can see the edges of the mountain in this kind of salmon colors and dark oranges. And then if we come to the shoreline and the rocks, you see some more reds. Again, those oranges and pinks are involved, kind of rimming things. And then right directly down on the beach, you see like individual rocks are outlined in, again, these very like warm autumn red, pink, orange colors. Jane told me this is a technique that makes objects in the canvas kind of pop or appear like subtly with a dimension beyond the canvas. And I then had an absolute heyday thinking about animism, the animate earth, the life within the rock, right? That is, I think, suggested or revealed, you could say, by these bright tangerines and these pinks that are really only consciously discernible when you come quite close to this land. Additionally, this painting, this landscape is cut by these three beams. They converge into a prism of pink. So I'm going to read to you from the beginning of this essay. It's called Distance Over Light. The essay starts with some self-introduction because it's located very near the beginning of the book, and near the beginning of an essay collection, you need to get to know your narrator. You need to know where your narrator is coming from. That introduction, for me, that self-introduction, unfolds over a series of essays, probably at least 3 of them. But here's how this one handles it. Distance Over Light is written in titled segments. So I'll read you this first one, which is called Point of Origin, Douglas, Alaska. As a child, I ached for open ocean. Too young, I wanted to pull the water all day with a paddle, feel the push of water on the hull of a kayak. When finally I was 5 and permitted out on protected waters, floating things called to me. A feather, a chip of ice. I'd reach out and touch those small perfections, afloat and temporary like me. I'd tap them once to see just how they rode the surface of depths. But still I ached for open ocean, and when finally I was big enough to take my own kayak into the swell, nothing healed. That ache went down into the pit of me, made a home there. Now grown, I ache most for bare rock, high ridges that know the bellies of clouds. Then, as now, I buckle for spare, clear places, ones lying outside the edge of densities. I'm going to skip a few pages of this essay just to move us forward to the painting. And I'll give you just a couple of pages that start to dialogue with the work of art. Recently, I met a Yukon-based landscape painter. Her subjects: sea, rock, ice, air. Her palette: grays and browns and every muted blue between. Her idea: refracted beams of bent light. I see in her paintings something of the substance of my old ache, perhaps its depth or its weight, perhaps simply the dimensionality of the open, the weight of clarity. Some years ago, the painter took a holiday to Norway and embarked on a sailing artist residency aboard a tall ship. She visited Svalbard on this wooden vessel with portholes below and skyward masts slung with cords and canvas sails above. Aboard the tall ship, and upon each of Svalbard's beaches where she stepped ashore, the painter worked with candles, sticks, and string. She sought a material way of thinking through old navigation techniques like triangulation and celestial observation, a material way of understanding her location in the physical world. How, the painter asked, can the land tell us where we are? And where, she asked, do my own reference points split from others? We're all here together, after all, yet we come from such different places, acting on such different convictions. That's something I'm really comfortable saying about North America writ large. I say it about my hometown. I say it about the continent. We come from such different places, acting on such different convictions. At sea, the painter created string prisms to mediate the line of sight dictated by the ship's portholes. On the beach, she set up strings aligned with distant landforms and therefore also aligned with history. She made lines and prisms, and she pondered the old ways. This is how the painter watched, day after day, for the various points of reference, physical and imagined, by which different people through the ages found their ways to Svalbard's shores. I listened to the painter, and eventually I understand that tall ship as a restored history, its technologies of the past, fairy artists across the present, somehow going both into and away from the future. In this, the ship strikes me as a kind of map, as both a time and place to think about the paths leading to what we might call here and to what we might call now. So, if you see this optical idea, these three beams, they do converge, and they converge in this pink prism, which in that essay, eventually I'm going to call that pink convergence, an impossible flash of light on ancient land. And there's a key in there for me about the flash of light on ancient land. I'm naming for you a continuum between the immediate and the vast. What we would call here and what we would call now. In permafrost as an archive, those are concepts that really peel off from the immediate and that edge towards something quite enlarged. I take an expansive view of here, and I take an expansive view of now. So let's talk about here. My book actually begins with a map. We commissioned this from the artist Kristen Link, and it begins with a map to get us situated in the Alaska-Yukon Borderlands region. This is northern southeast Alaska, southern Yukon, and northern BC, which is a mouthful, but those are some of the widespread and popularly used words to point at this kind of larger region that we're in very physically and also very historically. So what's important to me, you've got coast mountains coming up the middle of these borderlands. You've got rainforest biomes leaning in from the coastal side, and you've got boreal forest biomes leaning in from the inland side. And this map is a drawing of that. Also, you've got millennia of human trade and travel and intermarriage linking inland and coastal people across those mountains and across those rainforest and boreal biomes. In this part of the world, eventually contact happens. There's some British fur traders and trappers on the inland side, and a lot of Russian sea otter harvesting on the coastal side. But contact happens, it happens in spades on the coast, which somewhat buffers inland people. And again, they've got British fur traders, walking around for sure, but not that many of them. And they're getting lots of Russian colonial objects via Tlingit traders. But this is one of the huge differences between contact on the coast and contact inland. It's not until World War II. It's not until World War II, when the U.S. builds the Alaska-Canada Highway, that white people really, in numbers, start putting down roots in Yukon. Whereas, coastal Tlingit people have to get really involved in these cross-cultural politics of a very established Russian presence and learn a whole new set of cultural policy practices when the Russians pull out and the Americans move in. The upshot is that in this part of the world, ancient human histories are really very closely intertwined across these mountains, and our colonial histories are also very interconnected. Doesn't mean they're the same histories, but they're quite linked. And so those are some of the environmental and human dynamics that really fascinate me in northern Southeast Alaska, southern Yukon, northern BC, or really in this Borderlands region. I'm going to read to you an excerpt from the sister essays that offers an origin of the origins of this place. I'm going to read an excerpt about the formation of the land, which is so integral to the making of the people. This is from the sister essays, The Young and the Old. The young is about geology, and the old is about archaeology. The rocks are very young. It's new land. But the people have always been here, so the old is about that. Anyhow, this is the young. Pinpoint diffused. Of all the geologic maps, my favorites are the terrain maps. Along the northwestern edge of North America, terrain maps depict warped bands of accumulated bedrocks, crustal material accreted onto other crusts. Terrain maps of North America's accretionary belt reveal our most essential foundation to be a jumble, a loosely tangled smear, a twist of fragments grafted onto movable edges. This geologic reality underpins a vast region. It's the story of the St. Elias Range, shared along the borderlands of eastern Alaska and western Yukon, of the whole southwestern half of Yukon, of all of southeast Alaska, and virtually all of British Columbia. My focus lies at the heart of this area. Center lies here, in the tripart borderlands. It is the place to which I belong by birth. It is the place to which I belong by lifestyle, by permanent address. But I am considering a new idea of origins today. That is, that I come not from place alone, that I come also from a family lineage, and that mine is a lineage of people displaced. That I come then from a human current, and a restless one, which, for all its own tumult of displacement, displaced and displaces others. I am considering this very seriously, though I feel every day that I am at home. And so I try to understand this dissonance of belongings by enlarging my sense of things overall. Indeed, what happens when one so enlarges one's notion of the center, taking a geographic and temporal enormity with ambiguous edges at that as central? The thing broke apart. At its surface, the planet is crust, two kinds, continental and oceanic, 15 or so main plates in all. One can make a portrait of the planet by sketching its jagged net of fault lines, charting the world as a restless complex of spaces between. But in ancient times, before anyone could decipher the Earth in terms of its own liminal edges, the plates we would recognize as continents today were clasped together in a single landmass, Pangaea, which translates to all earth in Greek. And all that land was surrounded by a single unbounded ocean, Panthalassa, all sea. The earth has changed since then. For as the core principle of plate tectonics holds, the Earth's crust never sleeps in its search of the world's edge. I'll give you some technical documentation of all this since I know you're dying to see it. Now Pangaea is broken. Now Panthalassa is split. Now the Earth is made of two Americas, of Europe and Asia, of Africa, Australia, Antarctica, and of the oceans between them. But of course, this is temporary. A frozen image, a still life. The thing broke apart. It's been in motion ever since. Shot, reverse shot, and action. The Americas draw away from Europe and Africa. Magma rises from a rift in the sea floor, the mid-Atlantic ridge. Cooling magma creates new oceanic crust. The planet's expansion in the Atlantic plays the yang to the yin of contraction in the Pacific. There, the Pacific plate jams into the western edge of the Americas and subducts, dense basaltic seafloor inching underground into the molten deep underlying all the Earth's crust as we know it. Grinding its way down under the continental edge of North America, the Pacific Plate feeds itself into the mantle like a sheet of steel into a furnace. My part of the world lies here at the western edge of North America, where the subducting Pacific Plate not only moves mountains, but makes them. Here, the Pacific Plate curves and crumbles in an ongoing plunge, thrusting all that lies above farther and farther skyward. Here, mountains rise as continually transformed as steam. Here, we cannot forget that inherent in transformation is loss. I'm saying that kind of all the time. Inherent in transformation is loss. And I'll also say this, plate tectonics probably in no way excuses human displacement of other humans. But I do think that in the Earth's own timeline of crashing and crumbling and accreting and subducting, I just suspect there's a wisdom in the rocks, kind of within that geologic sense of time, that we would do well to ponder. So I'm very interested in geology cast in terms of its immediacy, by which I mean things like plate tectonics is happening right now. I'm very interested in geology cast in terms of its immediacy, because that requires us to consider really core foundations, bedrock, right? As movable and in motion and transformative and temporary. I'm always saying inherent in transformation and loss, and for me that starts here in geology. And I like that thought, because if it is a thought one can begin to think about bedrock, then I wonder if it is a thought that one can translate, say, to a government policy or a school system or a culture of thought. Because part of our inheritance in North America is, more than the rocks, is also somewhat ugly. We have a residential school system to contend with. The assimilation project is quite arguably part of the bedrock that our multicultural, colonial, contemporary North American society is really built on and stands on. So residential schools, the system starts in the US. The system's quite easily adopted by the Canadian government also. And our continent's church-run residential boarding schools are explicitly designed to support these two governments' project of eradicating indigenous cultures. The last residential school to closed in the 1990s in Saskatchewan. Yeah, the 90s. So this is profoundly not before my time, right? This is my time. Maybe it's yours too. But beside that, Permafrost is an Archive is a book that kind of tries to set all that down. It dabbles with what I call another sense of time, in which if it happened, then it is in some sense my time. It's ours to help carry. So the residential school that I write the most about in this book is Chutla. It's the school in Carcross, Yukon. I'm going to read to you the first couple pages about going to the Yukon archives. Here's the archives. I think there's an enormous amount of really fascinating work that's being done on residential school systems, a ton of interviews, especially with Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And it seemed like a good idea for me to do my learning in a way that didn't put too much pressure on other people to relive painful things. So I really went to the archives for this one thing, to try to come into relationship with our residential school systems. So this is just a few pages from the Chutla essay. It's called Chutla, Truth and Reconciliation, and it starts with an epigraph. Murray Sinclair. Murray Sinclair says, "Education got us into this." I will go to the archives. What will I look for? Another place, simply, where the past speaks? I call Linda Johnson, former territorial archivist of Yukon. I tell her I'm going to the archives. What should I do there? What should I look at? What should I learn? Linda's response is prompt. She points me to the archives' residential school records. Chutlas. Why? Because they exist. Because the Anglican Church left records. The Catholic Church hasn't shared anything, says Linda. No records. We have only survivor accounts. They surged in, the Roman Catholics did, with highway construction. Anglicans were already around. They were in a real competition for souls. Baptists were around too. In the 40s, they founded a school in Whitehorse, the Whitehorse Baptist Mission School. But like Northwest Canada's Catholic church-run schools, the mission school also chose to leave no records. The only residential school records in Yukon are Anglican church records at the archives. They went through and destroyed particularly troubling items, but there's still lots there. There are restrictions, of course, to protect privacy. So there's lots to see, and there's also lots you can't see. But for example, you can still read church workers' correspondence. There's a fair amount of it. You can still page through certain clips from the school newspaper. I will follow Linda's advice. I will see if old papers and pamphlets speak of the histories among us just as rocks and ice do. The archives are well lit. The ceiling is triangular and made of something strong but translucent so that light from the sky, light from the world, washes over the research tables. I look at the light overhead and wait for an archives technician to bring me Chutla's public records from the stacks downstairs. She arrives and unloads a series of trays, placing them on the table in front of me. There are pamphlets, letters, a couple of books. She's curious about the materials I requested, materials she's pulled from the stacks and carted upstairs, and so she lingers. We page through documents together for a few minutes. We talk, then she leaves. Of course, I'm going to come back to her. But at this point, I continue alone. I pause over a brief column printed in the Weekly Star on August 27, 1915, titled "Foreman Wood Here." The column reads in its entirety, stay with me as best you can, 1915. Jimmy Wood, the Indian boy who has been foreman of the Northern Light Office, the Chutla Indian School printing office near Carcross, was here several days this week on his way to his ancestral home at Moosehide, where he will engage in teaching other natives the gentle arts of civilization. Jimmy has been a pupil in Carcross School for the past 9 years, or just half his life, he now being 18 years of age. Foreman Deck of the Star office gave Jimmy his first lesson at typesetting in the office of the Daily Alaskan in Skagway several years ago, since which time the little fellow has become quite proficient at the business. Jimmy may decide to start a paper, the Moosehide Morning Scent, in his own village. What is behind news like this? The past or the future? I reflect. Those gentle arts of civilization, those gentle genocidal arts. Every day we fumble our way into the unknown, and every day reporters reflect this wayfinding back to us. Jimmy may indeed decide to start a paper, and if he does, he will daily or weekly or on a schedule of his choice do what reporters do. Remind us something has happened. Something is in the midst of happening. Now. Those gentle arts. So I'm going to skip forward in this essay, and what you're missing, what you're going to miss, is some history about residential schools, and some potentially juicy, difficult memories from my own schooling with the Juneau School District in the 90s. This is a memory that involves some paper headdresses of the eagle and raven moieties, headdresses that, interestingly, that we wore at this very museum. The text, my book, includes some adult uncertainty about whether we kids handled all of that in a good way. I suspect maybe we did not handle that field trip in an altogether good way. And I share that to reiterate that the narrator of this book is, yes, bound up personally in education policy, and in the ways that school reverberates into society at large. So that's what we've skipped. And I'm going to uptake and give you just these 2 pages that will return us to the archives technician. Some moments happen once. Some moments repeat. Again, it is my first day in the Yukon archives. I wait at a long table for an archives technician to bring me Chutla's public records from the stacks. The ceiling glows overhead, a tented shell between my long table and the sky. The archives technician arrives and unloads a series of trays, placing them before me. There are pamphlets, letters, a couple of books. She stands opposite from me and leans over the boxes, lingering, curious to see what I pull out, curious to see what's there. We will talk, and she will leave, but in this version of the memory, the talking is central. I open a folder. The pages inside are all hand-drawn, hand-decorated around some typewriter print. A whole sheet of signatures decorates page 2. What is it? She marvels. And I shake my head. I say, I don't know. It's true. I do not know what we are looking at. We turn the pages over and around and pass them back and forth, and eventually we find these words: our first school newspaper from the Chutla Residential School in Carcross. Oh, she says. My grandma went there, she says. Then my mom. Stops with me, she says. That's why I do my art. That's why I do my carving. She mimes the curving and scooping gesture of carving yellow cedar. We are 2 women leaning across a table together, elbows splayed wide, heads bent close. I've come to the archives to learn and to think, and to do this at my own pace, to do it without putting pressure on others to relive a painful past. I'm touched by the land's rocks and by its ice, and I've come to the archives to do my due diligence with papers and pamphlets, to close my eyes and see how a document, like a rock, can break the silence. My grandmother went there, she says, and then my mom. It stops with me. That's why I do my art. That's why I do my carving. Her voice is steady. I came to hear the documents speak, and they do. They sing out from the trays. They sing out from the first person standing next to me. That is how I meet the artist Lorraine Wolfe. And that's why even my archival research is driven really by an artist interview, and by a very long and slow engagement with the mask carving project that eventually became the cover art winner for Northwestel's 2020 to 2021 phone book directory. Lorraine was working on this. Sometimes at work, she brought in the tote bin. There's all of that amazing, like that smell of yellow cedar shavings, and this like partially made mask. Anyway, this is what it became. So it bears mentioning that that even though I went to the archives to interact with old shelved things, I also interacted very closely with this project in progress and its incredible scent that insistence of yellow cedar. I'm going to wrap up. I'm going to wrap up by explaining the title of my talk. The title of this talk was Deep Mapping the Alaska-Yukon Borderlands. So just about a minute here to tell you about this name. Deep mapping is this is the writing practice. Deep mapping is a term coined by the indigenous Osage writer William Least Heapmoon. William Least Heapmoon had questions about America. What is America? What is going on with America? So he zeroed in on America's heartland. He zeroed in on Chase County, Kansas, the middle of the middle of the middle. And William Least Heapmoon wrote about the geology of the Flint Hills. He wrote about soil science. He wrote about Christianity. He wrote about cattle ranching and about this town called Saffordsville, population 5, that undergoes these massive and destructive floods every so often, but those 5 people still live there. So William Least Heapmoon brings this deeply pensive and poetic lens to combine these political and social, spiritual, and scientific layers of the place. He calls this deep mapping. The deep map of Chase County, Kansas, is this book here, Prairie Earth. Huge brick of a book. Every page is beautiful. So deep mapping is a way to make an overlay in language that offers both a very earthly and a very human portrait of a place. And that's what I hope that I've done in Permafrost as an Archive. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming out. I'm really happy to take a couple of questions. If you are gathering your thoughts, I will just mention that should you feel inspired to talk a lot more about maps or a lot more about resistance writing, I do get to teach at the Northwards Writer Symposium in Skagway this year, May 26 to 29. There are flyers on the table if you are up for a 3-day Skagway trip with a bunch of writers. Again, everyone is invited to that kind of thing. Is there a question that you would like to pose about this material? Yeah.
Oh, here, let me bring that mic so we get it on the recording.
Can you talk about the permafrost aspect of your book?
Oh, if I must. Yeah, so this book has been titled Another Sense of Time for more than 5 years. And I have been informed from multiple sources wiser than I that this is too abstract. So another title was chosen from an essay. One of the essays in the book is called Permafrost as an Archive. Yukon is largely discontinuous permafrost. So one of the weird and awesome things that I did during my research year in Whitehorse was I went on a field trip with the permafrost lab because they had found a textbook perfect retrogressive toe slump. So yeah, I know. Like, sign me up. So really this means like they found a landslide in progress, and they put this crew of like 12 or 15 of us in a bus and drove us out the Alcan and put us in hard hats and in fluorescent vests, and we walked into the forest a little ways and into this kind of basketball court-sized hole in the ground. And that gives me opportunity to think about how much ice on Earth really overlaps with human history on Earth. Thanks for asking. Yeah. Does anyone else want to pose a question? Yeah.
Do you have a day job?
Do I have a day job? Oh, barely. That's such a good question. Yeah, extremely part-time. I teach at Alaska Pacific University. I teach creative nonfiction in the low-res MFA program in creative writing there.
Creative non.
I've got
what is
one.
that? So you don't teach anything in Juneau? I mean,
Twist some arms for me.
I've got one. Icebergs are pieces of the past. Did that work?
Yeah, but say more. Icebergs are pieces of the past.
Yes. And then they melt away. And they were there for a long time before they started melting up to that. They're pieces of the past.
Yeah, strongly agreed. What it brings to mind for me is how coastally so much of our ancient ice is glacial, right? But inland, they get it's much drier. So they have ancient ice also, but more ice patches than this like massive glacial action that we see on the coast. And an ice patch is really fabulous for the archaeologists. An ice patch is just like a glacier. It's so small that it does not flow with gravity. So anything encased in it is just going to stay encased in it. So thank you for mentioning icebergs. It makes me think alongside the permafrost, yes, there is so much that the ice holds for us, as do the libraries, as do the archives.
Have you heard of the boneyard of around Fairbanks?
What would you like to tell people about it?
There's a family that has a gold mine, and they have one of those big
Dredges?
dredges, yeah. And they're getting hundreds of bones out of their.
Oh, my.
Yeah. No.
Yeah, you.
They're getting hundreds of bones out of that gold mine.
Is this melted ground?
Well, it's melting, but they're also squirting it with high pressure gold dredging equipment.
We have a lot of that action, I think, happening throughout our inland Arctic and subarctic places. I think like Dawson City is one of the places where almost every construction project yields some like very important paleontologic or archaeologic find. The 40,000-year-old desiccated wolf pup was on tour in my Whitehorse neighborhood. I walked across the street to pay my due respects to the 40,000-year-old desiccated wolf pup. I think this is very true. It is absolutely a graveyard, but in the most beautiful sense, that we live and walk on. Does Frankie have a question?
I do. If I can
Share the mic.
Thanks, Jay. Is this on? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it actually is part of my question is water as a reformation of life and rocks and landscape. And I haven't read your book, so is that aspect something you'd like to address or didn't, because there are these two other very strong protagonists of here and now and time?
Are you asking about is like water bringer of life?
More the aspect of the word reformation, reforming into something new, stronger. Just curious.
Oh, that's fascinating. I would love to work with that word, but no, that is not one that I have dabbled with.
Okay.
Like the amount of time that I spend wishing that cryostructure was a more interesting word than it is. It is like perhaps excessive. I should move on to another fine word. So thank you for putting a good one on the table.
Okay, yeah, I think we have time for one more, and then Corinna can.
I have a question about
Yeah.
another interesting word.
Would you like the
hold on.
mic?
The word you used was when one piece of art dialogues with another.
And if you could remind me what that word is and expound on it. And as Jay was talking, he's a painter, and I'm sure that there's going to be some dialogue in his sketchbook from the inspiration of your talk. So if you could talk on that. I often think about it, for example, is Ode to a Grecian Urn fall under that title? Yeah, okay. So
Yeah.
if you could speak on that, thanks.
Yeah, happy to. Ekphrasis is a Greek word and perhaps started out as a Greek tradition. And really, what it means is when one work of art dialogues with another work of art, key is that these have to be across, like from one medium to another medium. So when writing dialogues with a work of art, it's like specifically not quite art criticism. It's not an art review. There's this long list of things that it isn't. So I am asking the word dialogue to do a lot of work here in this definition. And you can get quite heady and theoretic, I think, with like what is the history and the craft of ekphrasis. But I have not found anything clearer than this notion of a conversation. You know, if my rock opera is in some way entering into conversation with your weaving, then I've done something ekphrastic.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for asking. Hey, thanks for coming out, everybody. Thanks again for hosting.